Hello, how are you doing? JFL here from JFL.com, and you're very welcome to Body, Mind, Self, where we focus on perception, presence, and control, and the various fascinating and interesting topics that you send in. Thanks to everybody who did send in topics for today, and today's selection include regrets and what to do with them, struggling with confidence, how to hit the balance between apparently having too much of it or too little of it. A difficult challenge that is facing a lot of people at the moment, running a business, a family business specifically in the pandemic, how to think about that and maybe some psychological approaches that can be helpful. Medication and therapy, can the two go together and complement each other, or are they different approaches? We'll unpack that a little bit more. And also studying and developing good study habits, some reflections on that. So if you find any of these topics valuable, please do like, subscribe and share. And do remember to share your experience as well. And any questions or topic suggestions that you have, please send them in. And you can do so in the comments using hashtag bodymindself on social media or directly on jfl.com. So hopefully you find some of these ideas inspirational. They give you some good ideas, but remember, everybody is individual, so do get personal advice and support when it comes to applying any of these in your life in a specific way. What works really well for one person mightn't for the next person, but still I hope you'll get some good ideas from some of the ground that we cover today. All right, let's take a moment then, if we can, to just simply stop. Because as you may have noticed, really the core of all of this type of work is based in attention. What are you doing with your mind? Where are you directing it, in one direction or another? And if you think about it, even in the worlds of business, advertising particularly, what is the currency? It's attention. That's what everybody's trying to get. So we can talk about that being good or bad or anything in the middle, but the point is, if we aren't managing and safeguarding and training our own attention, well, then who is? And it doesn't need to be an advertising agency just trying to get us. It can just be sometimes our own thoughts, the habits that we get lost in. So let's be practical with that if we can. Let's intervene rather than just getting lost in those thoughts. And if you have a moment, if you don't, you can come back to this later, no problem. But if you do have a moment, give yourself a little bit of room, if you would, to just let your shoulders loosen. And enjoy a nice big deep breath in. And just to give yourself some very simple room to just let the pace start to slow down a little bit. Just sometimes the momentum and the rhythm of each day just picks up a bit too much of a pace. And often it's not intentional or deliberate, but the train of thought is a little bit like a train on a track that sometimes isn't being steered, or the brakes aren't being applied. So as it starts to go downhill, it picks up momentum. So you're kind of putting on the brakes a little bit as you just stop and slow the pace down and give yourself some really simple room just to breathe and to be. And you might take just a very simple opportunity to notice where you are, to see some of the colors around you, or to hear any sounds that might be there around you. Noticing not just where you are, but how you are. Just checking in on yourself a little bit. Physically, how are you feeling? And while we might have a preference as to what the answer to that question is, there isn't actually a right or a wrong answer. There's just an answer. If you're feeling great, enjoy that. Just kind of connecting with those feelings, which you mightn't have even noticed fully before now. And if there's any discomfort, well, it's great to notice that, so that you can maybe allow some relaxation to be there if that's appropriate, or to take whatever action steps are needed in due course to address that, if that's needed. Either way, you're just being aware and you're benefiting from that awareness. So as you give yourself that space, just take a moment to enjoy being here, right now, in such a very simple way. All right. So let's go ahead and jump into some topics. I'm becoming increasingly aware that I don't want to have regrets in life. Have you any ideas as to how I can make sure this isn't an issue? So the presence of regrets in and of themselves doesn't need to be a problem. And regrets, I suppose, can be of two main types. I suppose typical true regrets, where you are actually regretfully looking back on the past and feeling bad about something that happened. But the other type is a kind of a proactive regretting, which is where you're looking forward and you're thinking about what might go wrong or what you might lose out on. Now, of course, at first glance, because regretting is typically uncomfortable by definition, it can seem therefore to be a bad thing and something we want to avoid. And there are definitely times when that is the case, and maybe it isn't too useful, or at least the quantity of it isn't useful. We're just spending too much time lingering on something which maybe isn't that helpful. But regretting, other than those disadvantages, can be an important learning tool. And again, that learning can go in either direction, because you can look back and regret something, but as a result of that, another way of saying you regret something looking back is that you are wiser now, and that you have maybe a different perception of that same situation. And hopefully that can be cashed out today in terms of thinking or feeling or acting differently. So there can be real value to that. And if it is the proactive type of regretting, well, then that also can be really valuable, because that in a sense is even better, because that's really what learning is all about, is hopefully the capacity to not need to make too many mistakes ourselves. If we can learn after 5 mistakes rather than 6, all the better. If we can learn with 1 rather than 5, if we can watch somebody else make a mistake and learn from that, even through history, that's all good stuff, because it's going to save us a bit of wear and tear when it comes to learning. But it doesn't really matter. It takes as long as it takes. The main point is to not let it take any longer than it needs to take. So therefore, if you have the ability to visualize what could go wrong, that, as I say, could be negative if the moment is the wrong moment, or if the quantity of that thinking is involving you just getting trapped or caught in a negative spiral. But if what you're able to do is think ahead for a moment and think, okay, well, what could go wrong in advance, and not spend terribly long on that, but be informed by it, well, as they say, forewarned is forearmed. So you're in a stronger position then as a result. So that's something that could actually be really useful. So you can regret things you've done. You can also regret things you haven't done. And that, I think, is an interesting point with regret, because when you recognize that, that helps us, I suppose, get out of this illusion that it's possible to play it safe in life. Typically when we're fearful of certain outcomes, certain things from the past being repeated, or we're looking back on something that we're not happy with, we tend to want to, if there are things we haven't done, we tend to want to put the foot down on the accelerator and make up for that now. If there are things we have done and they haven't gone well, well, then maybe it's a case of once bitten, twice shy, and then we're reluctant to do those kinds of things. But either of those approaches mightn't be helpful, because they're a bit too binary. They're like the example of driving. You don't just put the foot on the accelerator because you've been a little bit too slow in your driving in the past. Nor do you just put the foot on the brakes because you've been driving too fast. Either of those could be a good or a bad idea, depending on the situation you're in. So I think what we want instead then, hopefully, is that you're in a position now where you're feeling an awareness that either way you're living in each moment. Action is something, but not doing something is in itself something. That's also a form of action. Choosing to put on the brakes is also a decision that's going to affect your movement down the road. So likewise, choosing to avoid certain things for fear of negative outcomes can be a problem, but also so can needing to do things for fear of not having done those things. So if you recognize that, that can be helpful in a way because it takes you off the virtual fence that maybe you thought you could be on. Now that at first can be a bit scary because you're forced to play the game, so to speak. You're forced to make decisions, and you mightn't like that. You might say to yourself, well, I'd rather sit this one out. I'm afraid of the past being repeated or of making the wrong decision. So let me just stand by the sidelines and sit this one out. But don't work that way. You're living right now, and that's great. Again, maybe it's a bit scary to realize it, but it's true, so you might as well realize it. And of course, you still want to make good decisions, but that's the point. It'd be better, I think, to focus on making good decisions rather than the fear of making the wrong decision. Now, it's a bit of a subtle point, but that can be informed by past challenging experience. But the difference is, rather than just playing in a loop what could go wrong, you're taking some learning from what has gone wrong in the case of a real past regret, or potential learning in the case of something that you're thinking ahead that might go wrong. And then you're taking that and you're extracting some learning from it. You're juicing out all the good richness of the education of that experience. And you're saying, okay, but what does that mean today? The purpose of our life isn't to not fail. What does that even mean? To not fail suggests there's something you actually want to begin with. What is that? And what's the best way of going about achieving it? So the simple examples sometimes are useful here with this because, if you look back to childhood, you could say you regret falling while walking and not walking more quickly and more effectively. So, of course, you really shouldn't regret that at all because, firstly, it's not your fault. But secondly, it's not only not a problem, but it's actually a necessary part of the developmental processes of learning to walk. So you can't bypass it because what you'll be bypassing is some of the necessary work that's needed. You can't get a super app or a book and even if you were able to read before you were able to walk, understand that information and therefore get it. Because what you actually need is the movement of the muscles and even the balancing and the shaking. All of that is training your system. And there isn't really a way of bypassing that. So all of that's extraordinarily helpful. So likewise, a good bit of failure in life is a very, very valuable thing. And there is an argument to say if things are going fabulously, sometimes you're not pushing yourself enough because a bit of failure can be useful. It's like if you're a software developer. If everything just works perfectly, you're probably not challenging yourself as much as you could. If you don't need to, I suppose fair enough. But, the point is pushing the boundaries, seeking to grow does involve a little bit of discomfort. Now, what we don't want to be doing here, I think, is just looking for discomfort. We don't want to be that kind of an adrenaline junkie addicted to kind of the masochism of pushing ourselves as hard as we can. Again, it's not that some of those feelings are wrong, but they're the secondary point. The primary point is, who the hell am I and what's my life about? Let me move in the direction of what seems meaningful. Let me use my learning and education to help take better steps along that path. And to the degree I need to push myself somewhat to do that's fair enough, then that's welcome. But pushing yourself isn't exactly the point. So yeah, I think if you can shift the attention to living fully and living meaningfully rather than not having regrets, you're going to achieve the same thing anyway. And then all of that supposedly bad experience actually serves you really, really well. You're going to be able to use that to help refine your approach, which is something that's going to be really helpful and very, very valuable to you. So this is a core theme. It affects, I suppose, everybody in different ways, but it's a real central one, and that's confidence. I struggle with confidence and hitting the balance between being too confident and not confident enough. How can I hit the balance? So when considering confidence, it can be good to flip things on their head somewhat and kind of turn it around a bit and say that rather than relying on a good strategy in order to be confident, actually turning that around and starting with the confidence. I might say, well, how do I do that? Well, I mean, just literally the act of needing a strategy sometimes can be us taking our self-worth and our self-esteem and placing it out here and telling myself, well, if I get to that point, if I get a correct strategy, then I'm allowed to feel good and well within myself. So that can be a bit of a problem, just the way it's structured. So what I prefer personally is to structure it something along the lines of, no, who I am, that sense of value and worth towards myself, that's there as a fundamental starting point. I don't need to justify it. I don't need to try and someday achieve it. I don't need to run the perfect software in order to feel that way. I have permission to start with that. It makes a big difference. Now, it's not that then you won't from there work on strategy. Absolutely, by all means do, and that can be very, very useful. But actually, it's going to be much easier to find good strategy if you're starting in that place. Because you've already put yourself back if your wellness is contingent on needing the right strategy. So rather start with just a recognition of the value that's there, and that self-worth is a kind of a foundation of sorts, a solid foundation that you can then build upon, and by all means in creative and imaginative ways, but you're in a good position to actually do that and to do a good job of it. So one distinction which is helpful when we have a difficulty with levels of confidence is that sometimes it's described as the difference between being assertive versus being aggressive. There's other various words used to describe it, but it is a useful distinction. And an assertiveness is a very different thing than an aggressiveness, but I think sometimes we conflate the two. And what happens, unfortunately, is that we might even have the capacity to be assertive. We might know somewhat how to do it instinctively, even if we couldn't quite describe how we do it. We might have that natural capacity. But because we think the assertiveness will come across aggressive, we're kind of afraid to be assertive. And then sometimes there's two things that can happen. One is sometimes we will just hide, so we maybe don't express ourselves in the way we could, and that can lead to frustration then. But the other thing that can happen is sometimes, particularly if that frustration then has accumulated over time, we'll then try very forcefully to express ourselves, and it will seemingly come across as aggressive rather than assertive in that way. So a useful thing to do is just meditate a little on the difference between being assertive and being aggressive. And you can see that there's really a world of difference between them. If we think of what it can mean to be assertive, and if you imagine another version of you or just someone else who you feel is an assertive person, you'll typically see that there are many different ways that you can be assertive. And one of the most interesting things to realize, I think, is that it's possible to be assertive, but also very relaxed, kind, calm, compassionate, caring, and actually focused on the wellness of another person. So that's very important to appreciate, because recognizing that and spending a little bit of time thinking about that can help kind of reassociate and salvage our beliefs around assertiveness. So we can kind of rehabilitate that idea a little bit and realize that it's not only something that's perfectly valuable and perfectly worthwhile and that you have a right to feel, but it is actually something potentially very pro-social. It's not about being aggressive and trying to win against other people. It's about recognizing the power and the capacity that you have, and then using that, hopefully for good, in a way that's valuable for you, but as well for other people and for the world and the situation you're in. So if you're taking that kind of approach and distinguishing between those two, that's very helpful. And there's a lot of room here for different individual style, really, because you can be more extrovert and somebody who likes to talk a lot, or you can be somebody who actually talks very little or is a little bit more quiet. But equally, your presence can be assertive. It's not all about words. Words are overused sometimes. And it may be that, somebody is particularly good at speaking and that's their thing, but somebody else might be a great writer, or somebody else is actually good at just being still and present and, evoking a good vibe in that moment, or doing something with their hands, or, communicating through art or creativity or whatever it might be. So that's really important, I think, because the tricky thing is sometimes we stereotype confidence too much. We think of particular forms of it, which may certainly exist, but that's not the only game in town. There's a wide range of different ways for you to be confident. And if it's to be authentic, which of course real confidence has to be authentic, otherwise it's not really confidence, it's going to have to come from that sense of you being real and being about what you're about, and not trying to fake it, not try to appear a way that you're not. That's never really going to pan out. It's probably not going to pass the litmus test of other people actually believing it, but it's also not really going to pass the test of just feeling right or appropriate or comfortable enough for you to actually do it and for it to make sense. So recognizing that range is there is really, really helpful. So you can maybe think about the differences between aggression and assertiveness. So somebody who's kind, compassionate, capable, but also clear in the way they communicate. Great. What is that? How's that different from aggression? And maybe practice that. But then stylistically, even within assertiveness, even within calmness or confidence, what does your version of that look like? And there's clues there if you're not sure. If you think back to moments in your life where you have communicated at your most effective, or you have just felt confident, it doesn't need to be necessarily communication, but you've maybe interacted with other people, or even just been by yourself and you felt a good sense of confidence. In your better moments, we've all had better and worse moments, but in the better moments, what was that like? What was your style? What was the kind of approach that you took? And again, you mightn't have even been trying to take that approach. Very often in those moments, if it's going well, it just kind of happens naturally. So we don't kind of categorize it. But still, you can look back on it and you can learn from it. So there's some clues in that. And what you might do then is take that example and you might play with it a bit. You might practice doing things in and around that in your own day-to-day life. And like exercising muscles, you might practice speaking a little bit more that way or a little bit less that way. Just going to see what comes up for you. Even in terms of speed of communication, speaking a bit more quickly, a bit more slowly, playing with that. Maybe practicing listening more certain moments. In other moments, practicing actually speaking a little bit more. Practicing saying no a bit more. Practicing saying yes, maybe, and agreeing a bit more where that's appropriate. So if you're playing with that, that can be really helpful. I did that the other day. I like to try and practice what I preach occasionally. And I decided to be just deliberately as non-reactive as possible. Just as a meditation. Different days I do different things. So I was driving, and as fate would have it, it was a day where there was some rather interesting motorists on the road. So, somebody jammed out in front of me without indicating. I had to jam the brakes on. Very tempting to beep the horn. Not that it would be inappropriate to do so, but I was like, oh, no, hold it a moment. I'm practicing being non-reactive, so just give myself a bit of room. And again, funny the way these things go, because there were several other incidents. It was a very unusual. I wasn't even traveling far, but there were some very interesting motorists on the road doing some rather interesting things. So I was prepared to break my practice, of course, if it was really needed for the sake of safety. But still, just within that range of safety, I was saying, okay, let me practice a little bit less reactiveness now and just sort of see what happens and see how it pans out. So that's really interesting, and you build a kind of a mental muscle tone when you do that. So some of us may need to do it a bit more one way or a bit more the other way, but a lot of the time it's actually good to practice both directions, because even when you practice doing it in the way that you typically do it, like let's say you are typically a bit reactive, and then you practice actually being reactive, you might say, why would I practice that? It's good because you can become a bit more conscious of it. you start to notice the ways in which you do it. It's called overdetermination, where you deliberately practice something, even though it's maybe not the pattern that you want, but just so you become a bit more conscious around it. And then, of course, practice the alternatives as well. And what that starts to do is it sort of brings the spotlight of attention into habits so that those more deeply set reflexes start to kind of dissolve. And you can still do any of the things you used to do, but now it's a little bit more purposeful and more of a choice rather than just something you're doomed to have to do in a cyclical way, whether you like it or not. So bringing that presence in can be really useful. All right, so they are interesting times at the moment, and as part of my work, I help people in a variety of ways, but certainly some of the people I work with are in business, running small family businesses, or sometimes they're involved in bigger organizations, and it's challenging for everybody, but particularly for the smaller business, it's a very uncertain and very difficult time, because I think many people in that situation, they don't have a clear boundary necessarily between the work that they do and the income that they have from the business and their personal income, and they have a lot often invested in it. So this next question speaks to that. We're trying to adapt our family business to the pandemic. We don't have the same business as before. Do you have any suggestions as to how psychology might help? So in any situation that's challenging, it's really important to distinguish between the challenge and you. And the kind of hypnotic nature of how attention and the mind works can often be a problem here, because when something seems challenging, your attention can be very easily drawn into it. And to some degree that makes sense. You obviously want to be aware of challenges that are there. That's going to be important, so your head isn't in the sand. But at the same time, if your attention gets too drawn into it, what can then happen is you kind of don't have any space outside of the challenges to be able to think about them clearly and to be able to come up with solutions. So being solution focused really then is the priority. So the example of the captain of the ship is useful here. For somebody not that experienced as the captain, seeing bad weather at sea, seeing a bit of a storm, understandably their attention might be captivated by that, and they might go, oh my God, there's a big storm or there's big waves. But while we would want to recognize that, what we would also want to do is sort of step back and go, okay, what tools do I have at my disposal? What are the options? How can I best navigate in the face of what's in front of me? So that's kind of the second part, acknowledging, but then responding in some shape or form. So what are the options when it comes to something like a pandemic? Taking a positive approach is important. Remember, positive in this sense means being constructive. It doesn't mean pretending everything's great when it isn't, but it means being constructive. So my old example of the firefighter, I think, is useful here, which is that a firefighter is positive, but that doesn't mean they think there are no fires. It doesn't mean they think the fire is good. They fully admit that there's a fire, they see it, and they think it's bad. But what makes them positive or constructive is that they are going to do something about it. Actually, the bigger the fire, in a way, the more motivated they are, and the more they'll draw on whatever supports are available to be able to address it constructively. So something like this is the kind of approach that's going to be useful. While there are some options that aren't available, and something like a pandemic will do that, it'll cut some of the options that are there that were maybe there before. Let's not focus too much on what isn't available. The question is, what is available? What options are there that you can take? And you literally just get the pen and paper out and start to explore those options and, weigh them up against each other and take whatever looks like the least worst one, so shifting the attention in that direction. And when you start to shift the attention in that direction, what can happen is that you may have a terrible idea, then another terrible idea, and then another pretty useless one, and then an okay one, and then another terrible one, and then a brilliant one, and then another brilliant, and that's what starts to happen, because sometimes the mind needs to be unpacked. So be a bit careful about kind of half thinking about these problems as you go about your day and not being that inspired by the ideas that come up. Be careful about assuming that that's representative of the ideas that you're capable of having. Because if you're to stop and meditate on it for a while, or if you're to get the pen and paper out and give it a bit of attention, you'd be amazed what can come up. Some great ideas can come. Sometimes they will come immediately, but sometimes it'll take a little bit of time, and you need to create space for that, a conducive environment to that. So if you're in panic mode, you're focusing on the challenges, and you're not giving that space for those ideas, well, then they're probably not going to start flowing at all. So that is really important to appreciate, that you can give yourself that attention. And sometimes one of the strategies that's needed, you take whatever options are available, but one of the strategies in a challenging situation that can't be changed is actually just waiting. We sometimes forget about that. Weathering the storm, so to speak. So when we think about weather patterns, we know if it's windy and stormy outside, that is maybe a better moment to just stop and, batten the hatches and just kind of wait it out a little bit. Now, I appreciate that it can be hard to wait perpetually, so maybe you have to have that approach and some other approaches. Maybe there are other things you can be doing in the meantime. But the seasonal approach that farmers take is a nice metaphor to go to here, because the farmer, doesn't get infuriated every time winter comes. I presume they don't anyway, otherwise they wouldn't be happy each year. They don't get infuriated when winter comes and go, well, what the hell's wrong and what can I do about it? They kind of know that's part of the game. They know that winter is going to be very different than summer. Spring is going to be different than autumn. So they plan around that. So just as we have seasons in a given year, and some businesses, of course, do have seasons as well in terms of what they expect in terms of customers through the door, equally, there are bigger seasons, which might be like decades. They might be every few decades. They might be centuries. They might be millennia and so on, where if you look at the world, cycles do tend to happen. And things like pandemics, unfortunately, do tend to happen, as really challenging as they are. So it's kind of part of the nature of the world we're in. So again, the idea there is not to spend too much time resisting what is, but to spend more time acknowledging that we're at a certain point in a pattern and then using that time well. So this might be a really good time to reflect a little bit about what you're doing, make sure it is a fit for purpose. Is it the kind of thing that there's going to be demand that is going to return sooner or later? If so, brilliant. Maybe waiting it out is the strategy then that's needed, just minimizing your exposure at the moment and, letting a little bit of time pass by. Or maybe it's the case that actually there's a great need for what you're doing right now, but it's just the way that you used to deliver it or the way you used to operate isn't a fit for where we are in the world today. So maybe that needs to be adapted. And the other thing you can also do is use this time to reskill, to update, to upgrade. And sometimes we don't have enough of that time. So although we mightn't have chosen for this to be that time, why not use it and take advantage of it? So when we are hopefully sooner rather than later in a better place, you're then ready to go. And it has been like the passing of the seasons. It's time spring comes again and you're kind of ready to go, ready to hit the ground running. So all of that is going to really help. It doesn't guarantee, of course, that everything's going to pan out, but you can never guarantee everything's going to pan out. But what you can do is be constructive and get yourself in that space. And the worst thing that will do is make you feel better. The best thing it'll do is make you feel lots better and also hopefully have positive outcomes that come from it as well. Another consideration here is your customers. So I was talking more about you and your mindset, but from the perspective of your customers, make sure you're reassuring them if that's needed. It depends on what kind of business you're running. If you're running a business where maybe they could be coming, but they're not, why is that is the question. And maybe they don't even know you're open, so do communicate with them. Maybe they do know you're open, but they have a kind of a negative image of what it'll be like to go to where you are. Now, maybe that's right, and maybe it's not appropriate to have them over, or maybe it's completely wrong because your business is different than other things they're thinking of, or because you've put appropriate measures in place and it is actually okay. So communicating that's really important. It's not good enough that the quality is there if people don't actually know it's there as well. So sharing that can be really helpful, and not in any kind of a demanding way, but just communicating literally. So if people use your business at all, That's because there's some value to it. So it's nice to think of ways of reaching out with that value right now. And even if it isn't in the form of paid business just yet, you can still develop and maintain those relationships with people. So it'll hopefully be that sooner rather than later. And if that is possible now, then yes, all the better. You can communicate and make sure that happens as well. So one way of kind of pulling this together, a relatively simple technique, but a good one, and you can do this just in your mind's eye or with a pen and paper, is consider two circles. So one circle is your customer or your client or whoever it is that you help in the work that you do. And just to think about their needs, but their needs right now, because it might be different than 6 months ago or a year ago. It might be that they're in a different place now in terms of what they need and the way they need it. So thinking about what they need right now and focusing on that. And, you can spend a bit of time on this, of course, but don't take long to do it. Do it quickly, but then come back and revisit it if you need to. And then the other thing is another circle, which is you and your skills and abilities, what you're kind of all about. And again, you can spend a bit of time focusing on that. Well, what are you most equipped to be able to help people with at the moment? And what we're interested in is, if you overlap those circles together, is what's in the middle? What's the intersection of those two circles? What's the stuff you're good at and equipped to do and interested in, but they also need right now? And really focusing in on that and committing your attention and your resources to that, because that's what's going to work. What that is, of course, is going to vary massively from business to business, industry to industry, profession to profession, but it does exist. And the important point is, you may have done an exercise like this before, but it may be out of date, because values and priorities change as the environment changes around people. So if you can consider something like that, that's really, really useful. And this, of course, applies if you're starting a business now or just trying to keep a business running right now. Either way, the same principle is going to apply. And it's probably a good exercise to do on an ongoing basis anyway, because sometimes there's a bit of mission drift that happens over the course of time, where we're not as tuned in as we could be to customer needs. So good businesses tend to do that, because if you're really focused on caring for and serving other people well, bringing value to their lives, but you're also focused on what you're all about, then it's actually sustainable. If you were to just focus on people's needs, but not who you are, it wouldn't be sustainable, because you'd be going outside of your range of competency. If, on the other hand, you just focused on what you're all about, but you didn't give a damn about what people need, it's not really going to have any traction. People aren't going to be interested in it. And especially in a moment like this, having that kind of zoomed in awareness of where people are at is important. You can do any number of things to help this. You can ask friends and family, you can ask customers, you can survey people, you can do whatever you need to, but at least if you're looking in that direction and giving it any attention, you're going to get, I think, some pretty good ideas which should help. All right, so this is a question that comes up quite a lot. It was asked specifically recently, but it's a really good question. Is it appropriate to be on medication and attending therapy? Does one interfere with the other, or do they help each other? So anytime we're considering the role of medication and medical intervention of any sort, it should go without saying to get good medical advice with this. And one of the reasons why that's important is because of just how individual we all are, and every case is different. But the other reason is that the effects of medication on the system are not just distinct from person to person, but they can vary from day to day, just depending on what else is happening in the context of the medication that we're taking. So this is the problem sometimes with things like online research, where you try and learn, and it's not that there isn't some good information out there, but there's a lot that isn't as well. And probably the worst category is not so much good or bad information, but information that's circumstantial. So a person speaks with truth about an experience they've had, but that happens in a particular context, which may not be your context. So, just to be wary of that. So do get good personalized advice with this. It's really, really important. So medication covers a lot. Lots of different types of medications made from different things that operate in different ways for different purposes. So it's going to massively depend what we're talking about here and what the circumstances are. But I think broadly the answer is yes, medications can play a very, very important role with therapy, and therapy can play a very important role alongside medications when they're used holistically and in a mutually supportive way, preferably as part of an overall strategy. So it's nice wherever possible to have some communication between therapists and whoever the prescribing doctor is, if they're not the same person. Occasionally they are, but a lot of the time they're not. And that doesn't need to be extensive communication, but it's more just this kind of calibration exercise to make sure that everybody's roughly on the same page. And I find when I'm working with people and that is the case, that makes a big difference. So sometimes it's very necessary for a person to be on a particular medication because they really need it because of a major health concern, and it's sort of a given that they're going to be on the medication, and maybe they're going to be on it for life, or it's something that they really rely on. So of course in those cases it's a given, and yeah, there may be effects on the therapy, but the benefits, if they outweigh the negative effects, we're going to take that. And then what we're going to do is we're going to do what we can to support any of those difficulties and help counterbalance them and, progress anyway. So that's going to be helpful. Now, sometimes it can be a little bit kind of borderline the decision where with something like anxiety, somebody's recognizing that, well, okay, maybe if I take an anti-anxiety medication, and a good one, that really does work, and it's been properly prescribed and the dosage is okay and it does help me, but do I really need that, or should I maybe work with some of the raw feelings that are there therapeutically, and that actually maybe is useful? Maybe I kind of don't want to suppress the feelings to some degree and I want them in a more raw form so I can work with them in therapy. So that's a valid point, and that ultimately is for you to decide in conjunction with your therapist and whoever your prescribing doctor is. But the thing to realize, I suppose, is it can go either way. It can also be the case that sometimes if the feelings are too raw, that it is hard to do the therapy. So that can be a problem as well on the other side. So what I like to recommend, certainly to my clients, is not to be anti-medication or pro-medication, but to be pro your well-being, and just to consider on a case-by-case basis, based on the evidence, what is actually going to be a fit. And again, medication can include a lot of things. We're not just talking about taking the strongest thing on day one. There could be much milder supports and things in the middle, which can be, sometimes helpful stepping stones. And the physiotherapy example, as usual, is just a really good example here, because I think something similar applies psychologically. So, pain management is something I work with quite regularly. And if you use that as an example, let's say though somebody is attending a physiotherapist for a moment, and they ask the physiotherapist a similar question. They say, I feel pain and the painkillers do help me, but I don't want to just do painkillers. I want to make changes beyond that. Should I take the painkillers while attending physio? So if we think of it in that way, yeah, some of the same considerations are there, because it is true that if there's too much use of painkillers, well then, yeah, you mightn't be able to notice what parts of the body are tense if the painkillers are maybe relaxing the muscles. To some degree, we maybe need to check in on that and have an awareness of what's happening. That can be helpful. But it is also true the other way, that if a person is just in very strong pain and muscular tension, and they can't then actually do the physiotherapy because the discomfort is so strong, then that's not going to be good for the therapeutic process either, on the other hand. So there's some balance to be found. So of course, if the medication isn't needed, fair enough, great. If the therapeutic process quickly enough is able to stabilize things, and many therapies, certainly the types of therapy I practice, that's one of the big considerations we have at the start of a therapy is, do we need to do work which is just sort of quick and efficient to just help stabilize things? It mightn't be the most thorough work even in the world. It's not that it's shallow either, but the problem is if you want to get very thorough, that could take a long time, and you might have a long time, and it might be hard to do that work, because if you don't basically stabilize things, well, then you just don't have the attention for it. So sometimes there's some kind of quick gains that can be had that will just show us that we're able to feel a bit better, and then actually give us the space to be able to work on making some of those other improvements. So I think that's a good way to think about it. It's useful. You can see there isn't a specific answer in there, but I think it's a responsible way of thinking about it, so that you're not ruling anything in or out. And in a sense, I like to just take the word medication and just stretch it, because you can use the environment as medication. You can use forests as medication. You can use prescription medication as medication. You can use certain types of thinking as medication. You can certainly use meditative practices as medication, and food, of course, is medication, nutrition. There are so many things, and physical activity is just a massive one. So there are so many things which, in a sense, are forms of medication. And the comparison holds because you could actually use even comedy on television as a way of numbing feelings, so you don't end up then working on them, just as a painkiller might numb feelings, and that could be a bit too much the other way. However, on the other hand, the painkiller or the comedy on TV could actually be, to the right level, just what you need to loosen up enough to recognize what's going on and then do good therapeutic work on those topics. So being holistic in that way is really helpful. Have good conversations, I think. Have open conversations with whoever is involved, and try as much as possible to achieve joined-up thinking. Now, I know I have so many referrals I get from hospitals and other places, people who've been through the system, and they say, oh God, this person's telling me this and this person's telling me that. It's tricky. I really do empathize with that. But it still doesn't mean we shouldn't try our best, to achieve it. Maybe in 100 years from now, we'll have achieved better joined-up thinking in healthcare. But between now and then, I think the best thing is that you are the captain of your own ship. And, at least as much as you mightn't want the job, if you can be the one that pulls these different strands of advice together and tries to be holistic, that's for the better. All right, so we have time for one more topic before we start to wrap up for today. I'm getting back into study and want to have good study habits. Any tips? So study is an interesting thing because, of course, if we're going to be formally studying in a college or a university or a course or in school or whatever it is we're doing, we're going to want to do a reasonably good job of that. But the truth is the skills of studying well are actually pretty universal skills that we probably all do with sharpening up on and, practicing in a day-to-day sense. We're all learning, and, sometimes that's formal, sometimes it isn't, but it's a really, really useful set of skills to practice. So there's a lot that can be said about studying well, but a few kind of key points that are important. One is that I think a lot of the time the mistake that we make is not focusing on the core content of what we're really interested in a course. And sometimes, to be fair, the course structure makes it hard. You might have long courses that have kind of points which are a bit obscure and hard to grab hold of. But the truth is that in any subject that you're studying, there are certain key points. There's certain fundamental points that matter. In history, there are certain kind of key fundamental dates or things that happened and the effects of them. In geography, there are certain formations and certain ways that things happen and certain keywords that matter. In any practical skill that you're learning, there are certain key techniques and methods and so on and so forth. So not to be scared, I think, is important by the breadth of the material that's there, and to try as much as you can to kind of get some good core notes as you're studying. That it's not even about writing a lot. It's sometimes not even about writing anything, although note-taking can be useful. But it's more about assimilating and understanding yourself. What the hell are they talking about here? Why is this even a subject? What's the core point here, and what's the essence of it? And you can ask people who are experienced in the area. You can go online, and the internet has greatly changed study, and you go into message groups where people are obsessed about the thing that you're trying to study, and just ask them, what do you think is the most important thing here? And it would be hard to get them to shut up talking about it, because people love these things. and they're really interested in them. And then, of course, you've got videos online and loads of other great resources that very briefly can sum up the essential points. Now, I'm not saying that you just look at that, but the point is if you have a core sense of what it's about, that's something for all the rest of the ideas to almost magnetically cling to, and it gives you a bit of structure in your way of thinking. So if you can start your study with that, that's already going to help everything, because there's going to feel to be much less pressure on you. If it's just this big library of information, you kind of feel disheartened before you even start, but that doesn't need to be the way you approach it. And semantics is the word that's used to describe how the mind works, how learning works, and really the way we encode information, the way we form neural pathways between the neurons, the brain cells, is based on meaning. So what happens is things that are similar tend to form associations or connections, and things that are useful or meaningful tend to resonate much more. So for most of us, there are some exceptions, some people who have exceptional skills in this area, but for most of us, it's really very hard to kind of learn off by rote just volumes of information that doesn't have any relevance. But when the information is relevant and significant, it becomes much easier for it to resonate, and all the better if we can picture it and feel feelings about it. So if we're learning about anything really, it's nice sometimes to almost get in the mindset of the people in that field who have developed the techniques, or who have been those people in history, or think about the geologist who's obsessed about the rocks, or whatever it is that you're studying. If it's law or if it's accountancy, there's people in that field who have developed the state of the art in it and who felt passionate about it. So if you can kind of almost get into that story a bit, I'm not saying you need to read their biographies to bits and focus on that information necessarily, but it's more the mindset, the feeling of how these people approach that. And if you can see relevance in the material, it's going to be that bit easier for it to resonate and kind of stick, which makes the whole thing a bit easier. So that's specifically focusing on the materials. The other thing is balancing study with relaxation, relationships, health, activity, all that other good stuff. And that really is very important to do. It's a bit of a cliche, but it's very important, because having all of those other systems operating well will just put you in a good place to be able to learn more effectively. And I think the good news here is that learning is much more something which is qualitative rather than quantitative. So in other words, you've probably experienced this. You can have an hour where you really, something really resonates with you and you really get it. Or you could have a day where it doesn't. So that's good. That's a good ratio. So that means that it's not all about just putting the hours in. Sometimes you do still need to put the hours in because, you're going to still absorb it to some degree. But it's incredible how much can happen if you're in a good place. So put the hours in, but also put the hours into other things as well. Give yourself quality relaxation time to switch off, but also quality time to switch on. Schedule, sure, but it's not that it needs to be hyper rigid where you've broken down every single bit on your color-coded spreadsheet. It's more that you're just intentional and you're saying, okay, I'm going to spend the morning doing this and then this doing that, and you're actually having the time for all the things that matter. If you don't do that, what often happens is a kind of a subconscious self-sabotage. It's not intentional, it's not usually negatively focused, but what starts to happen is, as you haven't maybe chilled out, you start trying to relax while studying. And the problem is the reverse also happens. Then when you're studying, you kind of feel hard done by because you didn't get to chill out properly. So then that's not really happening well either. So it kind of goes back and forward. You're trying to study while you're relaxing, and you're trying to relax while you're studying, and you're not really getting efficiency from either thing. And so on with checking in with people, using social media and devices and so on. So this is a really good opportunity to practice developing discipline. It might seem like a nuisance, but actually it's really valuable muscle tone, and whatever the hell you want in your life, this is the thing that's going to help you get it. So seizing it as an opportunity to practice developing that muscle tone can be really useful. One other consideration which sometimes gets forgotten about as well is just the environment or the study space you're in. So just make sure that you have some sort of a space which is conducive to that. And what we want it is to be as low friction as possible. So what that means is we don't want a situation where for you to do the study requires you to be an absolute hero. You got to climb over something, you got to wrestle something else, you got to find something at the bottom of something, you got to find something else in another room before you even begin. It ain't going to happen if that's the case. It's just too much effort. So we want a very low barrier of entry to actually doing the things that it is necessary to do. So having some desk space. Ergonomics is very important here. There's great videos online. I've posted some of them in the past about ergonomics from physiotherapists and people like that. And just the difference between like sitting in an appropriate position with a screen in front of us, if that's what we're using, versus kind of being hunched or in a difficult position. We may be able to manage that for a few minutes, but over the course of hours, or to speak of weeks or months or sometimes years, by gosh, does that add up. And that's just an unnecessary hindrance. If you have, it doesn't have to be fancy, but a decent seat, properly adjusted, table in front of you, screens or books or notepads, or if you're doing creative work, your easel or whatever other tools you're using, all of this ergonomically makes a massive difference. So then you don't need to use as much psychology because you're not fighting a battle of will. You're already in a better place. So, of course, there's degrees here. You know, we might all love to have the lovely kind of Manhattan loft, which has everything laid out beautifully and a nice view and the light coming in at just the right angle. If you don't have that, don't worry about it. Use what you have. It's not really about any of that. But it is about just being a little bit thoughtful and saying, okay, what can support me? And not only should the space be ergonomic and suitable, not only should what you need be within reach, but it's important that that space is used for that purpose. Sometimes if you mix purposes too much in a space, you're going to kind of affect your conditioning. Your mind doesn't know what mode you're in, so that can be a little bit tricky. So it's good to have maybe a place where you relax and a place where you get your studying done, and to divide it up a little bit. You don't need to have a mansion to do this. Even if you're in one small room, there can be different parts of that same room, but it just kind of triggers you and switches you on then, so your mind knows what mode you're in and what mode you're not in. So do play around with some of those things. Remember that if you're studying at all, there's some reason for it, there's some value to it, so do remember that and channel that, and hopefully that can spark some good technique, but also interest in the thing that you're studying, so you can really get the essence of it, not just the facts and the figures and the information, but they tend to stick when the interest is there anyway. All right, so thank you so much to everybody who sent in those topics for today. Really, really useful ideas, I think very, very practical as well as interesting. And let's take a moment to draw some of those ideas together and reinforce them a little bit. So if you have a moment right now, great, and if not, no problem. You can maybe do this at a later point if your attention is needed for anything else. But if your attention is not needed, you might just give yourself a moment to simply stop. Loosen your body a little bit, your shoulders and your arms, maybe a little bit of a stretch so they're feeling nice and comfortable. And enjoying a lovely deep breath in. And out. Just relaxing now your breathing so it feels even more comfortable and even more at ease. And just really enjoy that recognition that you have some freedom to choose the direction that things move forward in. The capacity to focus on your life and your sense of purpose, and to not really have time to worry too much about regrets, because instead you're focusing on living fully, positively, and intentionally. So you might just picture what that looks like for you in practice. And a feeling of confidence within you, the right type of confidence, which isn't aggressive, it's assertive, but it also embraces your own style. the type of communication or just way of being which is a fit for you, which kind of comes naturally to you. And the challenges that can be there, you're giving yourself space to be able to adapt, sometimes just to wait them out until they pass by, and other times to adapt and to change what you're doing so it's a better fit for this moment. If you're supporting other people, if you're teaching other people, if you're serving other people in business, being able to be aware of their needs as well as your capacities, so that you're starting to see even more clearly what the overlap is there and ways today that you can really help people in a way that you're good at and in a way that they need. And also a sense of taking a holistic approach to be able to draw in the supports, the medication of whatever is needed as appropriately prescribed, but also as thought of more broadly as elements of nature, as the music you listen to, the food that you eat, the people you spend time with, all of these supports. But rather than using any of these things as ways of ignoring what's happening, quite the opposite. These are ways to kind of stabilize your system and to give better clarity so that you can then do any work that needs to be done to create positive and practical improvement. So as you look ahead into the hours and days that follow, you might also see yourself taking an approach of learning where you open your mind and you recognize what the most relevant themes and topics are and really embrace them and really enjoy doing that. Feeling a sense of balance so that you're working with quality rather than just quantity. And also making sure your environment is helping you, making sure that you have the space to do those things that are important to you so that it's just that bit more effective. It's that bit more flow and ease in your approach. So as you focus on some of these ideas, just treat these as seeds that spark the imagination in a positive way and let them resonate in their own way. And with that, you can enjoy a nice big deep breath in. And just relaxing your breathing so it becomes even more comfortable and so you feel even more at ease. All right, so thank you so much for being here for today's session. Thanks to everybody who sent in. And do remember that if you have comments, questions, topic suggestions, you can send them in using the comments section or using hashtag bodymindself on social media or on jfl.com. And if you found any of the topics covered valuable, please do like, subscribe, and share. So I'm going to be back for the next session. Please do join me for that on Thursday, the 24th of September at 8 p.m. GMT. And the best way to be notified about that is to subscribe on YouTube so you get the notifications. You can hit the little notification bell after you subscribe too. That way you'll get updates. Or also on jfl.com, if you subscribe to the newsletter there as well, I send out regular updates and there's new videos each week as well as updates about the live sessions. All right, so take great care. Enjoy putting some of that into practice, and I look forward to checking in next time.